I declare open the Olympic Winter Games.
Oh, now that's an entrance.
Welcome to Beijing.
Леонид Ильич Брежнев.
I mean, I think sports and Olympic Games are a relatively harmless thing in the grand scheme of the world order. And if we can't even have an inclusive world order in the realm of sport and the Olympic Games, that really doesn't augur well for the future of a more inclusive world order.
The Olympic Games, a stage for athletic prowess, but also a battleground for political agendas. The International Olympic Committee claims to oppose the politicization of sport, yet history paints a different picture. Host nations like China use the Games to flex their muscles on the world stage. Victories bring national prestige. Athletes become symbols of protest. And diplomatic boycotts further muddy the waters.
Regional rivalry has really played a big role in the fact that we had 3 consecutive Olympic Games hosted by East Asian countries for the first time. It was the first time ever there had been a series outside the conventional Western powers.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we delve into the complex relationship between international politics and sporting events. How do the Olympics reflect current geopolitical trends? Can sports truly be a bridge for cultural understanding? And what does the future hold for the 2024 Games in Paris?
I actually think competition is about collaboration. I get to collaborate with you so that you can bring out the best in me. And when I'm my best, I get to bring out the best in you. So overall, I think the Olympic truce holds tremendous value, and the large majority of the country or the world honors that for a cause that's bigger than our national interest and more for the sake of our global humanity.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Sarah Hillyer and Dr. Susan Brownell. Dr. Hillyer is founder and director of the Center for Sport, Peace, and Society at the University of Tennessee, and Dr. Brownell is Curators Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the University of Missouri-St. Louis. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggett, president of Network 2020.
So, Dr. Brownell, starting with you. Sports, I think a lot like arts or music, are an important vehicle for soft power. So just to get all of us on the same page, how would you define soft power? And following that, for which countries is using sports as soft power most effective? And kind of adding on one final question there. And are the Olympics more or less a vehicle for soft power than other kinds of sports competition? Like, does the grandeur and bigness of it all overshadow its soft power potential?
Well, the phrase soft power was invented by the scholar the Harvard scholar Joseph Nye to refer to power that does not come from the barrel of a gun, military power or economic power. So it's really cultural power. It's the power of attraction. And he used as an example the US, which in some ways has been the model for a country that has a huge amount of soft power in the world. It really refers to a positive national image. And in terms of the cultural strength of the US, it comes from Hollywood movies, NBA players. So sports play a big role in the US's soft power. So that was Nye's formulation. Actually, though, the use of Olympic Games to promote a positive national image really predates that. So, and in some ways, it was Japan that started that trend with its hosting of the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo, which were intended to indicate Japan's sort of peaceful reincorporation into the international community after the catastrophe of World War II. And actually, Japan paired that with a World's Fair, so the Osaka 1970 World's Fair. So that was sort of a model that then got picked up in East Asia because of the rivalry between Japan, China, and Korea. So Korea next used that model with the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games, and then China felt like it really had to get on board and it couldn't be left behind. And so China's desire to host an Olympic Games in large part came out of that East Asian rivalry. And then it finally achieved its goal in, of course, 2008. But that was a summer Olympic Games. And then meanwhile, Japan had hosted 2 Winter Games, and Korea won the right to host the 2018 Winter Games. So then China was sort of like under pressure, like, oh no, we're getting left behind again. We better host a Winter Olympic Games. So, you know, then they were all even, except of course, Japan went ahead and hosted another Summer Games in 2021. So that regional rivalry has really played a big role in the fact that we had 3 consecutive Olympic Games hosted by East Asian countries for the first time. It was the first time ever there had been a series outside the conventional Western powers. So these days, countries that are using the Olympic Games, and there's also the FIFA World Cup, and there's also World's Fairs, you know, it's still kind of a big thing in East Asia, but there is also Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. So countries that they aren't major military powers, and they're looking for other ways to make their mark in the international community.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hillyer, in your work at the Center for Sport, Peace, and Society, you lead a team that helps global leaders develop innovative solutions to social political challenges using sport. So why have you seen, how have you seen sports to be an effective means for this? And can those lessons be translated to a highly complex and visible podium, pun intended, like the Olympics?
Pun intended. Well, let me just add on to Susan, because first of all, you fully encapsulated like the East Asian rivalry and the history of soft power. I wanted to add some context to that because I think what you said is so important. Then there was 1972, you are the expert, but what we know is ping pong diplomacy between the US and China. And that was also like this first-ish like recognition, I think, on the American side, very unintentionally, about the power of sport for this new thing called soft diplomacy. And then the US Department of State's response, or kind of brainstorm after 9/11, was how do we more creatively and more effectively engage disenfranchised youth around the world to prevent this new norm, unfortunately, of disengaged youth being radicalized for terrorist purposes. And so it was in response to 9/11 that our State Department formed what at the time was called Sports United Division, which now has been renamed the Sports Diplomacy Division. But it was essentially within the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs of, okay, how do we engage youth in a meaningful way? And sport was at the top of the list. Music was at the top of the list, art. So you think all these forms of pop culture, and engaging a strategy that was about people-to-people diplomacy, soft diplomacy, as Dr. Susan said, not down the barrel of a gun. And so going back to your question, really, the launch of the Center for Sport, Peace, and Society was based on what was untermed at the time, sport as a tool for development and peace building and sports diplomacy. We started this initiative in '94, actually in China. And really all of that became evidence that beyond anecdotal evidence of the power of sports, that no matter what your language is, no matter what your culture is, no matter what your faith perspective is, socioeconomics, that it had this really unique power to bring people together in a way. So I think one of the most interesting things about sport as a tool for diplomacy and peace building that goes unspoken is what sport provides is an agreed upon set of rules. There are rules of engagement in sport defined by the sport. So football has rules, basketball has rules, tennis, and those are agreed upon. And I think oftentimes in conflict, and I mean war and conflict and displacement, the rules the rules that should govern humanity are broken and dismantled and become confusing. And I think as a microcosm of like what we hope in this world, that rules and order define the way that we interact with each other as humans, somehow that remains intact, right? And there's penalties, and everybody agreed to those penalties if you're outside the rules of engagement. And so I think when people of differences come together within the confines of a sporting event, or that there's this mutual respect of the work that you've put in, the effort, your talent, your skills, what you bring to that court of play. But then there's this sense of safety that we have with one another because there's an agreed set of upon rules that we can bring out the best in one another. And I think war is a space where we bring out the worst in one another in humanity. And sport is a way that, like, Courtney, you, and Susan, you, I need you to be your best athlete and your best self, because without you being your best, I don't know how to get to my best. And so competition, although we use war metaphors for competition, I actually think competition is about collaboration. I get to collaborate with you so that you can bring out the best in me. And when I'm my best, I get to bring out the best in you. So the Center for Sport, peace at the center of everything we do in society, is really based on the humanity, the linguistic barriers removed, the cultural, the faith, and there's safety and vulnerability in having the opportunity to bring out the best in one another.
It's a really, really beautiful way to capture that idea. Thank you. Dr. Susan, turning to you, you started touching on this idea of regional competition when it came to hosting and sort of that power of hosting. I'd like to just stay on that for a little bit. In part, I'd love for you to, I have a two-part question. If you could first just talk about if you've seen any trends in host country selection over time, because obviously, yes, Japan, Korea, China, but also the rest of the world. Have you seen any trends in host country selection over time, and what the impact has been on hosts, particularly on ones that are emerging powers like China in 2008? And then how was China affected by hosting the Olympics, and how are other countries' perceptions of China impacted by it?
Yeah, so when Beijing hosted the games in 2008, we entered a really interesting period when the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, was pretty committed to giving emerging nations a chance to host Olympic Games, and taking the Olympics outside of Europe, and taking the Olympics to Africa even was kind of a goal. And so we had a whole string, actually, of Olympic Games outside of the conventional Western powers and going to emerging powers like Brazil, for example. Russia hosted the 2014 Sochi Games. Brazil hosted both the World Cup and an Olympic Games. And we had the 3 consecutive games in East Asia. And I guess from my perspective, that seemed like a very positive development, because my position on allowing emerging nations to host Olympic Games is that even if their system of government isn't the one that you want, I mean, I think sports and Olympic Games are a relatively harmless thing in the grand scheme of the world order. And if we can't even have an inclusive world order in the realm of sport and the Olympic Games, that really doesn't augur well for the future of a more inclusive world order. And those countries that are becoming more wealthy are a little, they're frustrated. There's a little bit of anger there. China will state it outright that They don't think the US wants China to develop and become a world power, and they're trying to keep us down, you know. So anyway, why not let them host Olympic Games, even if you don't like their political system, was sort of my position. However, it did look like there was a backlash against that, because then the rules for hosting were completely overhauled. It's no longer a public bid anymore. It's managed tightly in-house by the executive board of the International Olympic Committee. They choose hosts, potential hosts. They cultivate relationships with them is sort of how they describe it. And finally, you know, they arrive at one host that they recommend to the IOC session, and then, you know, they hope to get a positive vote on it. So, you know, somehow then the result of that system is the Olympic Games, starting with Paris and going forward, are all going back to conventional Western powers that have hosted them multiple times. So I do see trends. I see that there was inclusiveness. I saw that the IOC would not describe it this way, but you know, if you look at the pattern, it looks like a backlash against inclusiveness. It looks like the West reasserting its grip, you know, over at least the Olympic Games. So how was China impacted? If you look at national image surveys, it almost looks like the 2008 Olympic Games had a negative impact on China's national image. But that does differ between the developed world and the developing world, because I think for developing countries, China was a real model, and seeing that incredibly fantastic Olympic Games that they organized in 2008, which was probably the best organized Olympic Games ever. And a lot of people, myself included, would say it was the best opening ceremony ever. So anyway, seeing that, you know, was a real encouragement to India and to other countries in the developing world that thought, hey, you know, we can do it too. A non-Western countries capable of emerging and then standing on the world stage as an equal with powerful nations. So with national image surveys, then you do see a bifurcation between the developed world where it got worse and the image got worse. And that was probably because the US, Germany, countries like that suddenly saw China as much more of a threat than they had previously seen it. In that respect, maybe that's what China wanted, you know, the leadership. At least then China got more respect and was perceived, you know, as a powerful rival. So that is something that, you know, that whole traumatic process for China might have discouraged them from bidding again for the Winter Games. That bid was actually not really in the plan. It was a somewhat reluctant bid. But the IOC had formed, some members of the IOC had formed tight relationships with the people who had organized the Summer Games in 2008 and persuaded them to bid. They actually thought they wouldn't win because, first of all, you normally have to bid twice to win. But the other big thing was these already two consecutive games in East Asia, Tokyo, and the Pyeongchang Winter Games and then the Tokyo Summer Games. So it was two consecutive Winter Games in East Asia. And they thought that that wouldn't happen because the wisdom had been that the games should rotate around the world and that the IOC wouldn't send them back, you know, to a world region that had just had them. I think there was a little bit of a feeling that the West isn't all that happy about the rise of East Asia, so they probably won't, you know, let it happen again. So I think China was actually taken a little bit by surprise when it got those Winter Games in 2022. And then, of course, it's in the midst of a pandemic that China was blamed for. So, you know, that was yet another very traumatic experience for China. And when I was back in China in September, I was told that the State Sport General Administration, which is the Ministry of Sport, has decided not to bid for any more Olympic Games in the foreseeable future. I mean, I think they were really put through, you know, a tough process with both of those games, and they just don't really, and they recognize that it had both wins and losses for China's soft power. So I think, you know, they're going to put that on hold for a while and maybe focus on other things.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it was interesting too, having watched the Russia Olympics in 2014 as well. And I think that there was the criticism in the media of what was finished and what wasn't finished. I think it does have it can have that negative impact that's unintended as well.
Are you looking to deepen your understanding of global affairs and connect with a community of engaged changemakers? Network 2020 offers a platform for professionals and aspiring leaders alike. Gain insider access to expert-led discussions on today's most pressing issues. Connect with policymakers, business leaders, and activists from around the globe. Cultivate the skills and knowledge to analyze and understand the complex global issues shaping headlines every day. Click on the link in the description to learn more and become a member today.
Also, like, when I think about the games being in Beijing, I can't help but think that maybe more than ever that I can recollect were the conversations about human rights abuses and China's role in that. I don't know that it had been talked about and highlighted to the degree that it was other than around the Beijing Games. And then as subsequent World Cups, Qatar's bid, all of that, really human rights came on the scene, like directly correlated with, these mega sporting events. And Susan, I can remember, I think I told you this previously, being in Beijing, actually near Tiananmen Square, when they announced that that Beijing got the 2008 Games, and what a source of national pride it was. I also remember in those years when they were working on the bid, driving around Beijing, and we were working at many of the sports institutes and universities, and with the women's fast pitch national team, and seeing these crews, these like street crews, like painting trees and green grass to make it look more like it was green and friendly and, not such a concrete jungle. So it was interesting to see the ways that they portrayed what Beijing was to the IOC and those that were bidding and create. I mean, they put up fake palm trees everywhere just to beautify it. And the juxtaposition of beautifying the environment and then trying to hide the ugly of the human rights abuses, and how many people groups were displaced and unfairly and really more than displaced in order to create the venues for the game. Just the juxtaposition of that to me was really fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting how that, and I think that happened in Rio as well, and it really shines a spotlight on both what the country can do, and then also where the world sees a need for progress as well. So it can be a very double-edged sword. Dr. Sarah, continuing with you, you're a huge proponent of the ability of sports to promote peace, and at its heart, I mentioned this in the introduction, the Olympics are a place where countries can come together regardless of international political dynamics. I mean, I think that that's really the idea. And one of the long-standing tradition is the Olympic truce, which called for a cessation of conflict during and immediately after the Games. Yet Russia has been banned from competing as a country in both 2022 and 2024 because of their invasion of Ukraine. And this is the third time that I think that they've been dinged for violating the Olympic truce. So in light of what seems to be a pattern for Russia, how can the Olympics remain effective at bringing countries together?
Yeah, I think sadly, Russia continues to be the anomaly, but we need to see it as an anomaly, because I think the majority are honoring this truce and understand the value of what it does, and that it brings together our shared humanity. And so, I can only hope that that the positive outweighs the negative, and I think that there's demonstration of that, and hopefully the pressure that's put on Russia or other nations that break the truce, that that they understand that as they're positioned in the world and the world's perception of them actually matters through the lens of the Olympics. Every time I've watched the Olympic Games and we'll watch the Paralympic Games, and you see the athletes of Russia and Belarus, and they're representing, this like shared entity. To me, that is the heartbreaking part, are these athletes that have served their nation through representation of their national teams. And sadly, it's the choices of the powers at be that affect, the real humans in this life that, are athletes and want to do something positive with it. And so this is not a very intellectual answer, but I think it stinks, right? But I think the majority is the Olympics does every 4 years remind the gaze of millions and millions of millions of people who are watching, to remind us of the shared humanity amongst all of us. And I think more than any other sporting event, whether it's a mega sporting event or your local national sporting events, I love, love, love that during the Olympics and Paralympics that there is such focus on the human interest stories. Because yes, you have the most elite athletes in the world. You've got political challenges everywhere, but just for a second, you can pause, you can appreciate the athleticism, the commitment, the dedication, but then you get to know who these people are, the stories of the Ukrainian team and the focus on that and what they have been through and their commitment to stay in Kyiv or stay within the region and to be so proud to represent their country, I think provides hope for all of us. And, in the Olympics, of course, it's an opportunity for the underdog, in this case, Ukraine, right, to demonstrate that that there's a part of humanity that cheers for the underdog, that we want everyone, despite the challenges you're facing or the environment or your infrastructure or all the things going against you, to rise above that and achieve success. And maybe that's a very Western centered view, this sense of meritocracy. And but overall, I think the Olympic truce holds tremendous value, and the large majority of the country or the world honors that for a cause that's bigger than our national interest and more for the sake of our global humanity.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one of the things, having studied in Russia myself, that breaks my heart about this, and this goes back to the conversation about soft power, Dr. Susan, is one of my friends that I met in Russia, he chose to study Russian and in Russia, and he was a beautiful linguist because of the Olympics and watching the Russian gymnasts. And so, that it has such a power of attraction, and it's sad to see that bit get lost. Dr. Susan, this is a little bit of a continuation of the last question, but broadening it out. The Olympics, I think, when we look at it, it almost seems to reflect the world as we know it on a map. There's these neat borders, they're nation states, they're all coming together in one picture. However, the political realities, as we're talking about, are a lot messier. And today's geopolitical order is one that it seems even messier than before. It's been described by some of our past speakers as, a fuzzy bifurcation of different blocs and alliances and conflicting economic and political dependencies. So how does the international sports world reflect these realities, whether it's in the inclusion of non-UN recognized nations like Kosovo, Chinese Taipei, or Palestine, or in this idea of competing games like BRICS, or I think it was Putin's friendship games? So what other observations do you have about this neat picture that's presented by the Olympics?
Well, let me just start with a little bit of a history lesson, which is that when the Soviet Union broke apart, so in the 1990s and early 2000s, the IOC revised its Olympic charter so that today, it used to be like Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the Olympic Games, was proud of what he called his sporting geography or his athletic geography. So before that time, the Olympic Games didn't exactly map what was going on, with nation states. So there were, former colonies. There were territories under the control of a colonial power. Just all sorts of entities that weren't actually sovereign states. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, the IOC tightened the rules so that today you pretty much have to be a sovereign state recognized by the United Nations to be accepted, to have a National Olympic Committee accepted. However, some of the entities left over from the messy times were grandfathered in. So, for example, Hong Kong has its own Olympic team because it was grandfathered in. Macau never had an Olympic team. In 1997, Hong Kong returned to China, and China would probably be just as happy if the Hong Kongese had to represent China and didn't have their own team. Macau doesn't have its own team. So if they were to make an Olympic team, it would have to be the Chinese team, which is pretty difficult for them. So you have today you have all of these anomalies. You do have nations that aren't actually sovereign nations, and then combined with something that more closely maps the geopolitical map and the United Nations. So there's that. On the other hand, when you look at the athletes that represent the nations and the coaches that coach the athletes, you find that the lines between nations are incredibly blurry. So citizenship swapping is bigger than it has ever been, and it is now including nations that didn't used to be part of it. I mean, traditionally, athletes in former colonies maybe would represent the metropole. So former African colonies of France would represent France, for example. So that was more the pattern. But now you have things going on that are like all over the map. I mean, something that was really interesting was that Kyle Anderson, an NBA player, was allowed to swap citizenship to become Chinese because he had a grandmother from Jamaica whose father was Jamaican and mother was Chinese. So because of his quote unquote, Chinese heritage, he was invited to represent China with the hopes that it would help China qualify for the Olympic Games, but unfortunately it didn't. But so this is actually new for China. They just started it in the lead up of the 2022 Winter Games because China is rather xenophobic and it has a very restrictive citizenship law. Normally, naturalization is limited to people with a Chinese, ancestor. So even China has been reluctantly drawn into this transnational mess that actually underlies the nationalism we see when teams march into the stadium. I mean, many of the American athletes are foreign born or the children of immigrants. There are many American citizens who are representing other countries. So nationalism these days isn't what it used to be. I would also say, I was an athlete during the Cold War. I competed, I did track and field. I was a heptathlete. I competed against the Soviet Union, for example. And, sometimes people talk about, oh, we're entering a new Cold War. But I would say from the perspective of sports, it's not anything like it was during the Cold War. Because in those days, sport was one of the only places that you could run into a person from the Soviet Union. And when you were at these competitions, they were really tightly controlled by their chaperones. And they were not encouraged to learn English. Some of them did, but if they wanted to speak English with you, they would have to sneakily do it on the field, when the coaches weren't looking. So there was not even like free interchange between athletes during the competition because they were always being watched. For one reason, because it was feared that they would defect. So like the whole, in the Cold War, it was really a divided world, even in the realm of sports. And that is just not the case these days. I mean, in St. Louis, we have a former world champion pair skater, who's now a local ice skating coach here. just the way that people move back and forth between national borders is just, it's completely different. I would like to believe that we can't go backwards either. I would like to believe that whatever happens out there, that is not going to change.
Thank you. Dr. Sarah, one interesting bio point that I did not mention is that you spent 10 years working with the Islamic Republic of Iran in building a women's softball program. So I imagine that many people would be surprised to hear this, sort of based on our own stereotypes. And I think Dr. Susan also just referenced this idea of how, where sports can help different cultures and societies meet. So how do you see sports as being a way into societies? And what did you learn from that experience that surprised or challenged you?
Yeah. I think it's funny that you prefaced it with many people might be surprised. Even with our work with the State Department now, and this work in Iran happened a number of years ago between 1999 and 2008. But even now, I meet people in the State Department and they're like, wait, you were where doing what? So yes, it is very surprising. And at the time, 1999, I was probably, I don't know, 26 years old. I didn't know much about the Islamic Republic of Iran. The only understanding I had, it was like these distant memories of a black and white television when I was growing up, watching the hostage crisis, and the iconic images of our Marines with the blindfold and the takeover of our US Embassy in Tehran. So when I received this phone call, and the person who called me introduced herself as the daughter of the reigning president of Iran. At the time, her position was the vice president of the National Olympic Committee. And they were developing and had recently developed, under her leadership, the Islamic Federation of Women's Sports, which was for all female athletes residing in Muslim majority nations. And so they ended up working to create their own, what they called the Islamic Women's Games, or the Muslim Olympics, so that Muslim women could come to Iran and know that they had the utmost adherence to the Islamic dress code and the proper. So I think Iran hosted 3 or 4 iterations of their own Muslim Women's Olympics. And so I had the opportunity to take a Muslim woman American to those games and represent. And you talk about the most amazing opening ceremonies. It was in Tehran, watching all these Muslim women from around the world. And it was interesting because the time that we took the first American woman to compete in those games, it was in October of 2001. So it was on the heels of 9/11 that we went to Tehran to compete in the Islamic Women's Games. And we were seated in between the Afghan delegation and the Iraqi delegation. And we were a delegation of 2. And you can imagine the media frenzy, but the beauty of it was the connection and the ability to interact and to love on and to hug and to celebrate one another's athleticism and the humanity again with the Iraqis and the Afghans was absolutely beautiful. So for 10 years, at least 1 month every year, I was there to help develop just the Islamic women's sports system as a whole, which very much looked like our old AIAW. So before the NCAA, when it was like all women's league, it was all the coaches were women, all the administrators, all the officials, all the everything. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. So anyway, for what it's worth, it was quite telling for me that in the relations between the United States and Iran, somehow women's sports was on the radar to bring us together. So through that time, we developed the first women's Iranian fast pitch softball team. We brought an American team, which was the first American women's team to compete in Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. We also took a women's basketball team. That was the first. There today are still 13 women's softball teams in Iran competing, which is like the most Western American sport. But I would say the evolution of all that really demonstrated to me the power of sport to supersede long-standing. And did it solve all the problems? No. But do I believe that if the women who play softball in Iran and the women who play sports in America could rise to be the leaders, that our two countries could solve some problems? I absolutely do. I say the power of a softball bat can solve a lot of problems.
Speak softly and carry a large bat.
Exactly. We also said we were between Iraq and a hard place. So yes, the softball, yes. And we also say the Iranian women came up with a woman's place is at home plate.
Thank you, Dr. Susan. Thank you, Dr. Sarah, for this enlightening conversation. Really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the Olympics.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Liam Austin and Brian Thom. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.